When did the very thing that made you beautiful become the thing that made you bleed? When did your empathy stop feeling like a gift and start feeling like a slow, invisible death? You didn't ask to feel everything. You didn't ask for the sorrow of strangers to echo in your chest like the cries of a child no one can see. But here you are, heart open like an unhealed wound, absorbing pain like it's your purpose. They called you sensitive, gentle, deep, but they never warned you what that would cost. Shi Heng Yi didn't speak in riddles. He spoke in truths too sharp for the masses to swallow. He said the empath is not just someone who feels deeply, they are someone who bleeds in silence while the world claps for their compassion. And if you're not careful, that compassion will be your coffin. You thought your empathy would save you, but now it shackles you to energies that are not your own. You wake up tired from dreams that weren't even yours. You carry grief that entered your body like smoke and stayed like fog that won't lift. You're not healing, you're hosting, and the guests are ghosts wearing the faces of the people you love. You say yes when you mean no, because the guilt of setting a boundary feels worse than the exhaustion of being invaded. You apologize for your silence because you've been conditioned to believe your worth lies in your response. But this world doesn't just fail to understand empaths. It feeds on them. And the moment your kindness is no longer convenient, they'll call you cold, detached, broken, but you were never broken. You were devoured. What if I told you your suffering isn't accidental? That your soul signed up for this level of sensitivity not as a punishment, but as a portal? What if your ache is ancient? What if you've been an empath in lifetimes where it got you killed, burned, bound, silenced? You don't just feel too much, you remember too much. You were forged in the temples of pain. You were taught to listen in the dark. You were trained not just to survive energy, but to see through it. Shi Heng Yi calls it a dark gift, not because it is evil, but because it exposes everything false. And most people would rather die in comfort than live in clarity. That's why they fear you. That's why they drain you. You are a threat to their illusions, a mirror they never asked to look into. But you kept giving, you kept loving, even when your hands were shaking and your soul was thin. Because empaths don't just absorb pain, they transmute it. But what happens when you forget that you can choose what enters? What happens when you lose the line between compassion and codependence, between empathy and enmeshment? That's where the darkness begins, not in your gift, but in your forgetting. And until you remember, the world will keep using your light to fuel its shadows. You learned early that being needed felt like being loved, that if you could just hold their chaos, carry their wounds, understand their rage, maybe, just maybe, they'd never leave. So you wore the mask, the healer, the listener, the saint. But every time you smiled through betrayal, every time you forgave what broke you, that mask fused deeper to your skin. They loved your light, but only if it didn't expose their shadows. And you? You kept dimming, thinking silence was safer than rejection. But Shi Heng Yi warned, attachment disguised as empathy is the slowest kind of death. And empaths, more than anyone, are seduced by the illusion of fixing others. You called it compassion, you called it loyalty, but it was fear. Fear that if you stopped giving, they'd stop needing you. Fear that your worth was tied to your wounds, that without their brokenness, your identity would collapse. You didn't see that your mask was keeping you safe in a battlefield you never agreed to enter. You thought you were healing people, but really, you were abandoning yourself one apology at a time. And no one noticed, because the world praises the empath who bleeds beautifully. But now something inside you is cracking. The smile doesn't hold, the giving feels violent, and the mask, what once protected you, is starting to suffocate you. You see it now. Love shouldn't cost your soul. Understanding shouldn't require your silence. And empathy, real empathy, must include yourself, because the moment you see the mask, you can't unsee it. And once you feel the weight of it, you can't keep wearing it. The unraveling has begun, and the next truth will not be gentle. You thought it was love, the way they saw you, needed you, pulled you in with eyes that whispered, "No one else gets me like you do." And maybe in that moment you believed it, believed you were chosen, special, different. But that wasn't love. It was hunger, not the kind that feeds, but the kind that consumes. And you, empath, you were the perfect meal. Your compassion made you soft. Your need to heal made you blind. And your wounds, they made you loyal to pain that felt familiar. Shi Heng Yi calls this the trap of unconscious empathy, the belief that if you can just love someone enough, you'll finally be loved back in the way you always needed. But emotional predators don't seek connection, they seek control. They mirror your soul to win your trust. Then slowly, systematically, they unravel your center. Not all predators scream. Some come with silence, with gifts, with apologies dipped in manipulation. They say, "I didn't mean to." After breaking you, they say, "You're too sensitive," when you finally speak up. And you, taught to doubt yourself before anyone else, believe them. You defend them to your friends. You forgive them before they ask. You shrink your truth so they don't feel ashamed. And somewhere in that storm, you forget what love is supposed to feel like. You call the chaos passion. You call the withdrawal your fault. And the ache in your chest, you name that devotion, but it's not. It's the trauma bond, a chemical tether between your nervous system and their volatility. It's not romance, it's survival. And the longer you stay, the more your intuition dulls, because trauma doesn't just break your trust in others, it fractures your trust in yourself. You knew something was wrong. You felt it in the tightening of your stomach, in the way your joy disappeared quietly, but you overrode it again and again. Because empaths don't just feel, they overfeel. And in that flood, they lose the signal meant to save them. But something in you is waking up. The mirror is cracking. And what you see staring back isn't love. It's a lesson. One forged in pain, but laced with liberation. Because the same sensitivity that once trapped you might be the very blade that sets you free. You were never allowed to be angry, were you? You were taught that good people forgive, that spiritual people stay calm, that loving people stay quiet, even when they're bleeding. So you bit your tongue until your mouth filled with the taste of swallowed screams. You smiled through the shattering. You turned the other cheek so many times you forgot which way your face was meant to face. But that fire inside you, it never died. It waited, patiently, silently, like a storm gathering strength behind your ribs, because even the softest hearts can only bend for so long before they snap. And when it came, when the sacred rage finally rose, you thought you were breaking. You weren't. You were remembering. Because Shi Heng Yi says that real awakening doesn't come from peace, it comes from collision, from the moment you stop apologizing for how much it hurt, from the day you stop calling your self-abandonment compassion. This rage isn't ugly, it isn't toxic, it's sacred. It's what happens when your soul finally slams its fist against the cage of conditioning and says, "Enough." You thought anger would make you like them. But your rage is not their violence, it is your clarity. It is the holy scream that erupts when you realize your love has been weaponized, your empathy exploited, your silence mistaken for consent. This fire does not want to destroy, it wants to cleanse. It wants to cauterize the wounds they kept opening. It wants to burn down the illusions that kept you chained to roles you never chose. You were told anger is low vibration. But what if that was the lie meant to keep you docile? What if your rage is the very energy your healing requires? What if it's not a step backward, but the door you were never allowed to open? Rage, when purified by truth, becomes power. It becomes boundaries. It becomes not anymore. And in that moment, when you stop explaining your worth, stop negotiating your needs, stop waiting to be understood, something ancient shifts. You are no longer the mirror, you are the flame. And those who once controlled you with guilt will now feel the heat of your unfiltered essence, not because you want revenge, but because you refuse to abandon yourself again. That is the turning point for an empath. The moment you go from absorbing to alchemizing. The moment you reclaim the parts of you that once trembled under the weight of being too much. So burn, not in bitterness, but in truth. Burn away the mask, burn away the lies. Burn until only your real self remains, untamed, unapologetic, awake. Because your rage is not the end of your softness. It is the beginning of your sovereignty. There's a silence that doesn't soothe, it haunts. The kind that follows after you finally say goodbye. After the storm has shattered everything false, but before anything real has begun. That's where you are now, alone. Not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, existentially. You walked away from the people who misused your light, but now you sit in the dark with only yourself for company. And for the first time, you can hear everything. The echoes of every time you said, "I'm fine," when you were drowning. The ghost voices of those who only loved the parts of you that served them. The ache of every boundary you never got to set, now circling your mind like vultures. This is not loneliness, it's withdrawal. You're detoxing from the identity that was built around other people's needs. Shi Heng Yi calls this the hollow, the sacred void, the place where your old self dies and your true self hasn't been born yet. And it hurts, not because you made the wrong choice, but because for so long your nervous system mistook chaos for connection. Now, without the noise, the grief arrives. You grieve the friendships you outgrew but kept watering. You grieve the family members who never saw you clearly. You grieve the version of you who believed that love had to be earned through sacrifice. And most of all, you grieve the time, the years, the decades spent contorting yourself into shapes you thought would keep you safe. But grief is honest, and honesty is holy, because you can't heal what you're still romanticizing. And you can't move forward if part of you still wishes to be chosen by what broke you. So you sit, in the stillness, in the ache, in the sharp-edged peace of no longer chasing. And that's when the real healing begins. Not with affirmations, not with vision boards, but with truth. With finally seeing who you are beneath the performance. You are not your past. You are not their projections. You are not broken. You are breaking open. And yes, the solitude is cold. Yes, some days you'll reach for the old pain just to feel something familiar, but don't go back. Don't return to what you had to crawl out of. That emptiness you feel is not punishment. It's preparation. The universe does not take without giving. It clears, it carves, it empties so it can finally pour into you. Let the silence stay a little longer. Let it strip away the noise. Let it teach you how to be full without being needed. Because when you can sit in your own company and feel whole, no one will ever own you again. It doesn't happen all at once. The unraveling. It's not a sudden collapse. It's a slow erosion. One thought at a time. One memory. One truth you can no longer unsee. You look in the mirror and something feels foreign. Not your face. Your story. The narrative you've wrapped yourself in for years. The giver. The caretaker. The strong one. The one who holds space. The one who never asks for too much. The one who makes everyone else feel seen even when she's invisible. But now that story feels heavy, hollow, false, and the more you sit with yourself, the more it begins to disintegrate. Shi Heng Yi calls it ego death, not in the arrogant sense, but in the identity sense. The death of the false roles you were assigned, the personas you inherited to survive. It's terrifying, because even if the roles were painful, they were familiar, predictable, safe. You knew how to be needed. You knew how to be quiet. You knew how to disappear in the name of harmony. But now you're remembering the parts of you that never got to live. And it's messy, because as the old self dissolves, there's no new self waiting with open arms. There's just space. Raw, terrifying space. And in that void, every unprocessed emotion rises like smoke from a fire you thought was out. Shame, guilt, rage, grief, not just yours, but your mother's, your lineages, your culture's. The empath's burden is ancestral. You were taught to absorb long before you could speak. And now, you're unlearning in reverse, thread by thread, belief by belief. You stop saying, "I'm fine," when you're not. You stop calling your exhaustion a mystery. You start naming things for what they are. Manipulation, control, abandonment. Not because you want to blame, but because truth is medicine. And medicine often burns before it heals. This is where most people turn back. They crawl back to comfort, to old relationships, to numbing. But not you. Not this time. You've tasted your own becoming, and even though it terrifies you, it also frees you. You start to hear a new voice, quiet, unfamiliar, yours, the real you, not the empath shaped by trauma, but the soul untouched by it. And it doesn't demand, it doesn't people please, it simply is. Steady, clear, whole. This is what death feels like when it's sacred, not an ending, but an opening, not silence, but stillness. And in that stillness, you finally realize you were never broken, you were buried under stories, expectations, projections, and now you rise, not as who they needed, but as who you truly are. You used to think empathy meant giving until it hurt, that love meant staying even when your soul was whispering, leave. You thought healing meant holding space for everyone, even when you had no space left for yourself. And every time you crossed your own boundary, you called it compassion. Every time you swallowed your truth, you called it understanding. But you're starting to see it now, the lie underneath the label. Because real empathy starts at home. And for the first time, you're learning to turn it inward. Shi Heng Yi teaches that unguarded empathy without wisdom becomes self-destruction. That sensitivity without sovereignty invites chaos to make a home inside your chest. You once called that home love, but now you know better. Empathy isn't supposed to deplete you, it's supposed to guide you, but only if you stop weaponizing it against yourself, only if you stop confusing self-abandonment with virtue. You don't owe your energy to everyone who is hurting. You don't owe your light to those who use it to blind you. You can feel deeply and still say no. You can understand someone and still walk away. That's the new face of empathy. Not soft, not passive, but fiercely discerning, rooted, boundaried, sacred. You start recognizing your tells, when your chest tightens, when your stomach flips, when your energy drops after a conversation. You stop overriding those signals in the name of being nice. You no longer absorb every emotion like it's your responsibility to fix. You finally understand someone else's storm is not your weather to endure. You are not the shelter, you are the sky. You hold space, but you no longer collapse into it. And something shifts. The guilt fades. The clarity sharpens. You no longer feel bad for protecting your peace. You no longer shrink to be digestible. You no longer explain your boundaries like they're requests, because you've tasted what it feels like to betray yourself, and you refuse to ever go back. Empathy now looks like solitude when the noise gets too loud. It looks like letting people be disappointed instead of betraying your truth. It looks like silence over explaining, rest over proving, distance over dysfunction. And still, love remains. But it's clean now, free from obligation, free from the martyrdom that once masqueraded as kindness. This is where the empath becomes sovereign, not hardened, but whole, no longer a sponge, no longer a savior, but a mirror that refuses to distort itself for anyone. And in that integrity, your presence becomes medicine, not because you're trying to heal anyone, but because you finally healed yourself. Discernment was the gift you never knew you had. Or maybe the one you were taught to mistrust. Because for most of your life, you felt everything, but questioned yourself constantly. You sensed deception, but called it your imagination. You felt the weight behind words, but smiled anyway. You knew deep in your bones when something was off, when energy didn't match intention. But you gave the benefit of the doubt, again and again, until doubt became your default and truth became buried beneath politeness. But now, after the fire and the solitude, after the ego death and the reckoning, something inside you is crystalline. You no longer just feel, you see, not with your eyes but with your knowing. You catch the flicker behind their smile. You feel the distortion behind the compliment. You sense the pull in conversations meant to confuse. And where you once would have stayed to make sense of it, now you walk away without a word. Not out of coldness, but clarity. Shi Heng Yi says, discernment is the soul's immune system. It filters what's real from what's not. It protects your energy without explanation. It doesn't need to justify its number. And this is your new compass. Not empathy untethered, but empathy grounded in self-trust. You no longer abandon your intuition to maintain peace that isn't real. You no longer sacrifice your center to avoid making others uncomfortable. Now, when someone enters your field, you listen, not just to what they say, but to how your body responds. You track energy, not performance. You read vibration, not volume. And when something feels off, you don't wait for proof. You believe yourself the first time. Not because you're judging, but because you're no longer willing to bleed for what doesn't feel true. This is the maturity of the empath, the evolution. You stop needing to explain your distance. You stop playing translator for people who refuse to be honest with themselves. You stop betraying your own frequency to meet someone in their illusion. You understand now. Some people wear masks so well they forget there's a face beneath it, and it's not your job to peel it off. You are no longer here to carry everyone. You are here to embody truth, and that means you will be misunderstood, labeled as harsh, guarded, different. Let them misunderstand. Your discernment was never meant for their approval. It was meant for your liberation. And now, with each person you don't chase, each red flag you honor, each no you speak without guilt, your nervous system rewires itself into safety, into trust, into power. You begin to feel what it's like to be in your own body without apology. You are no longer a mirror for other people's projections. You are a mirror for their truth. And not everyone is ready for that. But the ones who are, they'll see you and they won't flinch because they've burned too. And they know the cost of clarity. You won't have to shrink for them. You won't have to explain your energy. You'll meet soul to soul, whole to whole. And that is the beginning of real connection. You made it through the fire, through the unraveling, through the sacred silence and the violent clarity. You've walked through every illusion they gave you, every mask you wore, every belief that said your worth was in your usefulness. And here you stand, not perfect, not polished, but real. And in this final becoming, you realize something no one ever taught you. Your empathy was never the wound, it was the weapon. Not a weapon of destruction, but of truth, of awakening, of remembering. Shi Heng Yi said the awakened empath is not just someone who feels, they are someone who sees, who discerns, who creates space that heals simply by refusing to lie. And you've become that space. You don't rescue anymore, you don't prove, you don't chase validation like crumbs from a starving table, because you know now the most powerful love you will ever give is the love you give to your own return. You walk differently now, with a quiet strength, not loud, but unmistakable. Because when you no longer need to be understood, you become undeniable. You no longer collapse for connection. You no longer shapeshift to soothe. You stand unfolded in your wholeness, and that energy, it rearranges rooms. You've become the version of yourself you were always afraid to be, unapologetic. Empathy is still your essence, but now it's sacred, directed, discerning. You give from overflow, not emptiness. You stay present, not porous. And you protect your peace like the divine altar it is, because you finally know the truth. Your energy is holy ground. Not everyone gets to walk there. And this is the paradox. The more you protect yourself, the more your light expands. The more you say no, the more space you create for your soul to speak. The more you let go, the more aligned your life becomes. You are no longer a sponge. You are a mirror, a gatekeeper to your own frequency. Yes, the world is still loud, still draining, still full of masks and manipulation. But you've stopped waiting for it to change. You changed. You stopped asking for permission to honor your knowing. You stopped dimming so others could feel comfortable. You stopped sacrificing your softness just to feel safe. And now, you love from power, not pain. You connect from truth, not trauma. You are not just an empath. You are a force, forged in the dark, rooted in the real. And you carry your gift not as a burden, but as a blade, cutting through illusion, clearing the path, making room for what's true. You don't just walk into rooms now, you read them. You don't just hear words, you feel intentions. You don't just vibe, you track vibration. And where there is manipulation, you walk. Where there is dishonesty, you vanish. Where there is love, real love, you stay, but only if it meets you in your wholeness. You no longer need chaos to feel alive. You no longer crave validation from broken mirrors. You no longer translate your essence to be digestible. You no longer tolerate what your nervous system has been screaming about for years. You've come home to your body, to your voice, to your inner sanctuary. Because now you understand. Your sensitivity was never a flaw. It was a compass. Your pain was never proof of weakness. It was the cost of remembering. Your solitude wasn't punishment. It was the portal. And now that you've crossed through, you're not just awake. You're anchored. So if you've been walking this road alone, doubting your strength, questioning your light, this is your reminder. You were never too much. You were never broken. You were never here to be everyone's healer. You were here to awaken, to alchemize, to remember. And now that you have, nothing can take that from you, because the empath who sees clearly cannot be controlled. The empath who trusts themselves cannot be manipulated. The empath who knows their worth cannot be used. You have become what you always were, the light that knows its own name, and now finally you speak it.